All right, everybody, we're going to get started here. My name is Paul. I'm an engineer at Red Hat working on Kubernetes, and this is the SIG-Multicluster intro and deep dive. So here are my co-hosts.
I'm Irfan. I work with Turbonomic, and I'll be taking some part of this session. And our intention with this session is to keep it interactive and open. So, I mean, at any point of the presentation, we can be interrupted or we can answer questions.
Yep. And I'm Josh Burkus. I also work for Red Hat and came recently involved in SIG-Multicluster. And I'll be talking about some specific areas.
Okay, so our agenda today is going to cover a history lesson of history of SIG-Multicluster, going to cover the current SIG projects that we have, and also, sorry, I am figuring out what that thing is. I've got it. I'll leave, I won't spoil it though. Exercise for the reader, watcher. So we're going to cover current SIG projects. We also recently in SIG-Multicluster have had a survey out, and we're going to talk about the results of that survey. It's around the adoption and interest in the community in the current SIG projects. And then we're going to talk about what's next. So as we said, today is supposed to really be an interactive discussion. So if you have any questions or comments that you want to make, please do feel free to just raise your hand and someone will, I have to imagine, take like a triple backflip off of this thing and go and give you the mic so you can ask. All right.
Okay, so we'll start off with a little bit of history. So the efforts around SIG-Multicluster has been quite long. The initial efforts were coined under Kubernetes, like this Uber control plane, which overlooks or overarcs all the Kubernetes clusters or multiple Kubernetes clusters, and sort of solves all the problems whichever might be there when multiple Kubernetes clusters are considered. The initial efforts under this term were the implementation of multi-zone KTS clusters. Okay. And the term Kubernetes itself did not stick for long. It was later coined into federation, and federation was viewed as this API surface, another API surface. It's like the same KTS API server placed on top of the existing API servers and given special meanings to the resources which are the same resources that KTS server would expose. So for an example, our deployment when passed on to or created in this API server, which we call federated API server, the replicas will be spread across multiple clusters akin to nodes in individual cluster. And in terms of simple resources like config map or replica sets, they'll simply be replicated. There were problems with this approach, and I wouldn't be actually discussing those problems. They have been discussed around multiple times earlier. So the SIG actually, this effort was under SIG Federation, and the SIG was labeled as Federation. Because of the problems and to widen the scope, and the folks at the SIG and thought that it would be better to widen the scope of the term federation and put it under a more wider term called multi-cluster, and not letting federation alone be an approach to solve all the problems, such that other approaches can also be included under the same SIG. So post that, we actually restarted Federation as Federation V2, which was implementation of a multi-cluster API or a Federation-specific API under or implemented as CRDs. We also saw 2 other projects, KubeMCI, which was Kube-Multicluster Ingress, and Cluster Registry. Of late, like earlier or a couple of months ago, we updated Federation v2 to KubeFed to disambiguate the term federation, because it was used, or we saw it used in wider formats, not just relevant to K8s clusters. The current state is sort of beta ready for KubeFed. And we also saw another effort under the head of cluster ID, which was about trying to fix a durable ID for clusters which fall under this multi-cluster domain. So the current active projects, or the current projects, some of them are not active right now, are KubeFed, Cluster Registry. Cluster ID was an effort which has a paper and currently no clear implementation, and the KubeMCI. So some rough idea about KubeFed is that it basically distributes the configuration or same K8s resources across multiple clusters, and the term or the definition we give it to is like it can coordinate the configuration across multiple clusters. Its current state is just short of beta, and that is something that we basically are trying to define if we should take it to beta as our next step or not. We have seen a lot of activity in KubeFed around last year or so. So some updates, we thought that it's meaningful to give out some updates that what we have done from last KubeCon. So from last KubeCon, we have updated the propagation status. So earlier it was difficult to find if the propagation of resources actually happened or not. So any problems that happen, we can find in the status of the resources, which we call at propagation status. We also updated how KubeFed handles annotations. So we found scenarios that the sync reconciler in KubeFed updated annotations, or we passed the same annotations which were defined in the federation control plane, and that conflicted with the local K8s controllers, because the controllers would also update the annotations. So we don't just update them anymore, and we skip them. Of course, we can override this behavior using some other mechanism. We changed the API group from kubefed.k8s.io and dropped the name K8s in it, because this does not necessarily fall under the core K8s APIs. We also made it possible to update the target API versions of the resources. So earlier we always used to target to the latest exposed version from the K8s API server. Now it is possible to update the versions and choose whichever we want to target from the control plane. We also were able to implement the validation mechanism using webhooks, and we were able to implement the JSON path overrides. So the overrides can now be specified using a JSON patch. So from next slide onwards, some details about cluster registry and some feedback and the response that we received will be taken up by Josh and
So the next project we're going to talk about briefly is the cluster registry. The idea is for it to provide an inventory for cluster metadata. So what are the endpoints of the cluster, or what are the cluster's endpoints? What type of auth does it accept? It's currently in alpha, and this is one of the areas that we've been trying to assess the adoption of the cluster registry and determine what criteria there may be for moving it to beta. You can see a link to the repo there on the bottom of the slide. One of the ideas that the SIG has begun to discuss in the last 6 months is a concept of cluster ID. The idea is that DNS names come and go, certs come and go, and so collectively we have been sort of identifying some properties of a permanent or extremely long-lived ID for clusters that would live longer than a CERT or a DNS name. It's currently existing in paper form. So the next step would be implementation of like a proof of concept. This is something that we might wind up wanting to plumb back into Kubernetes, but could be implemented initially as a controller over the metadata, fields of metadata. All right, go ahead.
So we mentioned that we had a couple of things here where we were trying to assess state, right? We're trying to assess whether or not KubeFed has enough adoption for us to be ready, and feedback to be ready for beta, whether or not there's enough interest in cluster registry. So we did what you usually do, which is survey a bunch of people. Now, at the point where I actually started compiling results, we only had 44 survey responses. It's not actually enough. I think there's that many people in this room. Did anybody here fill out the survey? Wow. So like, if all of you filled out the survey, do we have the link in here? Yes. If all of you filled out the survey, then we could double the number of responses that we have and have much more solid information about a bunch of these things. Please do. We've got the link there. I will also tweet it after the session, to again get the link to that, but it is still open because we're still trying to collect more information about people with multiple clusters, what they're using, what they want, everything else. So let me give a few highlights from the responses that we've received so far. So talk a little bit about who's already filled this out. We had a good mix of the different types of users that we have, including both end users and consultants and the big companies and providers and hosts. And we actually had a couple of research organizations fill out the survey, which was interesting because they had very specific needs that were different from a lot of the production users. We did overwhelmingly get responses by people who are using Kubernetes in production, which makes sense and is also great. And a mix of people who just heard over the survey that we got on Twitter, mostly people who follow the SIG, who at least read our meeting minutes, etc., which also makes sense. We also provided people, if you click on that survey link, I should actually have it at the bottom of each page here, shouldn't I? Oh well. If you click on that, if you go follow the survey link, you'll notice you can fill it out for your organization. If you are some form of a service provider or support company, you can fill it out for a specific customer that you have in your head, or you can fill it out for your customers in general. Any of those answers are perfectly valid. We're just trying to get an idea of what's going on and what people's needs are, and whether or not you've used, say, KubeFed and how it worked out for you. Now, we haven't gotten a lot of responses yet, but in terms of getting responses from the right people, we've done pretty well. Between the 44 respondees, there are 7,000 and some clusters under management. Size varies a lot across, most people are running somewhere between 3 and 7 clusters, and then we have our group of, that are running hundreds to thousands of clusters. Now, one of the things we want to discover, come through there is to actually figure out why people want to look at multiple clusters as something other than multiple discrete clusters, right? Why is it that you need some form of multi-cluster functionality? What's it for? Because it actually turns out that no theoretical multi-cluster tools can actually cover all use cases. So we need to get an idea of which use cases are more popular or more important. The number one thing that we've heard from users so far is that geo-distribution of some kind is something that everybody seems to have in common. So out of people here are running multiple clusters, how many people here really would like to manage geo-distribution better? Yeah. So that wasn't a big surprise. So I'm actually going to ask you to raise hands for a few other topics too, because I'm just interested in getting this right. How many people are looking at multiple clusters specifically for application high availability, for the ability to fail over applications? Okay. How many people here are looking at multiple clusters as a way of having those clusters on different kinds of clouds, either on-prem, off-prem, on different cloud providers? Yeah, we've got a bunch of those. Okay, more than one in the survey. See, so you need to fill out the survey now because the multiple cloud provider thing was further down the list of the respondees so far. So we really need your responses on that. So you get sort of the idea, and we had some interesting write-ins here too, where for things that didn't occur to us as reasons to multi-cluster, such as regulatory compliance, where people are required to maintain a certain amount of physical isolation between different clusters. So that's been interesting. We'd like to get your feedback on that as well for some of these answers. And so these two questions for these two, yeah, go ahead.
Let me give you a mic.
Sorry, new buy for the SIG-Multicluster. So I want to understand if the scope of the multi-cluster SIG is just managing multiple cluster by a single administrative domain, or do you also cover essentially getting multiple independent clusters managed by different users, different admins, into a more cohesive infrastructure, because that's the use case I'm interested in.
Right. Well, so my first response to that is please fill out the survey. I think our scope is anything involving multiple Kubernetes clusters, yeah?
Yeah, one of the things that that we're really here to talk about today is like understanding what the scope of the SIG should be. When we renamed the SIG from SIG Federation to SIG-Multicluster, we picked a more generalized name, but we really didn't establish a certain mission in terms of what the SIG's job was to do. So that is that's very much part of what we're here to talk about. If other folks want to offer what their thoughts and questions are about the scope of the SIG, I think we'd really like to hear that. No pressure, of course, but if you feel motivated to share, we're all ears. Maybe we can just keep going.
Okay, let's keep going. So we were looking really specifically because like one of the questions about going from alpha to beta with a bunch of the specific components is whether or not we have enough usage on those to determine that we have essentially the right API, right? Because once we go to beta, then we can still make changes to the API, but those changes have to be posted and everything else. And so we wanted to get some responses. So our responses I would characterize the responses we've gotten so far in cluster registry as mostly speculative, both between the what people said their state of usage was and the comments that they put on there seemed to indicate that people had looked at it, but they hadn't actually tried it. Which makes us not feel confident that it's ready to go out of alpha. Has anyone here used cluster registry? Raise of hands? Oh, okay. Is anyone here who doesn't work with me use cluster registry? Have people taken a look at the cluster registry? Yeah, so a couple of people take a look at cluster registry.
So one of the use cases I've actually heard folks articulate for the cluster registry this week multiple times, I'd be curious to see if this resonates with anybody, is the need to have like a central telephone book to be able to understand what all the clusters in the inventory were that's present on each of those clusters. So the idea would be that you'd have like maybe one central cluster registry, and somehow Kubernetes happens, and that the cluster registry's API resources are present then on each of the clusters in that registry for like a centralized telephone book or cluster location. Is that a use case that resonates with anybody here today? If I could see a show of hands. Okay,
Okay,
so
yeah.
that's kind of interesting. I will note that we saw a lot more hands go up for that than we saw for I've used the cluster registry. So maybe that's an indication that there might be something that we can do there in the community to fulfill that use case.
Cool. Should I go on?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the same questions about KubeFed. KubeFed was showing more actual usership in our responses. How many have people here used KubeFed? Yeah. So we've got and a lot of our written feedback, a lot of the free-form responses. Because you see, if you fill out the survey, you'll see we ask you whether you've used it, planning on using it, whatever, and we leave a big text blank for you to actually give us feedback about it, because that's really what we want. And the feedback was, in general, a lot more technical, whether it was positive or negative, in terms of people's feelings about KubeFed. That makes us feel a little bit more confident that KubeFed is really a thing, maybe ready to go to beta. Yeah?
Sorry, what?
Were you going to say something?
Yes, I was going to say, so KubeFed is currently in this state where we have done sort of beta release candidate releases, but what prevents us from being able to move the cluster, moving KubeFed to beta at this point is that the community of people that develop it is just simply not large enough for us to responsibly move it to beta. We do not want Kubernetes to be full of APIs that are at a beta or higher level, but don't have enough support within the community to be maintained. So one of the things that we're interested in understanding is whether there are folks that are interested enough in it that haven't previously contributed to it, that would be interested in contributing to it so that it could have a rich enough group of contributors to move to beta. One of the things that I'll just say on that note for folks that are here today or might be watching the recording is that the silver lining to the situation that we're in is that you can go and try KubeFed out. It's basically in the form that it would be if we threw the switch and cut 0.1.0 instead of another RC. So you can try it out in the form that it would initially be in if we took it to beta right now. I would personally love to hear feedback from folks that maybe haven't used it yet and are interested, especially in terms of, is it something that you could imagine as beta? And would you be interested enough in maintaining it, or interested enough in it having a long lifetime to help to maintain it? So let me ask, is there anybody in that category here that maybe you've considered using it, but you're not sure about using it because it's in alpha? Do we have anybody that's maybe in that category? I see one. I see a few more. Are you interested enough in using it that you would help maintain it if it moved to beta? Here's a question for you. I see some shrugs, and that's okay. Maintaining things is work, and I personally don't want to do any work, so I get it. That's a joke. I do like to do work. Interesting to know. Okay. You want to go?
Yeah, I know at least depending on the capabilities, we're already doing some things that sound like they might fit in that model, and maintaining some internal tool. But if we didn't have to, and we could have a community tool, we'd probably want that. So, want to contribute to that, I mean.
Are you willing to or able to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so right now, we're expecting, so I work at Adobe, we're expecting to have the number of clusters that we're managing to just explode. We've got like 10 or 15, and it would be reasonable, I think. We're thinking it's reasonable to expect that our business will demand us to make 50, 100 by the end of this coming year, and have to upgrade all of those and have service teams who are going to onboard to them all over the place. And part of that's because we can't make clusters that we think might that big enough maybe, and some of it is geolocation and all that. So we have a tool right now that allows individual teams to self-service onboard, and then we just let them use kubectl from there. I'm imagining some of them will think that that's horrible when they have to do that across 10, 15, 30 clusters, depending on what they're doing. So if there was some federation and they could say, do this, and that'll go over there, and I'm done. I think that could be interesting.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I think that you had said that you had already done some kind of tooling in that area, is that right?
Yeah, so when we make new clusters, we're manually registering them with this service we call a Kubernetes onboarder. So it's just like a Flask app, just enough UI to get the job done, and then it calls out to the Kubernetes API on each of the clusters. So.
Gotcha. It sounds like what you're describing is a DIY cluster registry type thing.
Yeah, it sounds exactly like that.
Okay, I think I saw another hand back there. Hey, there's a hand. Who's this guy?
Hi. So I think if anybody remembers like early KubeCons, do you remember what the #1 competitor to Kubernetes was when we did the same survey? It was not Mesos, not Cloud Foundry. Sorry? Swarm? No, not Swarm. Shell scripts. Right? I think we're at that same phase here, right? Where everybody is doing their own bespoke thing because we don't have a thing for them to do.
Dan, I'm going to give you a mic.
We can pass it on.
I guess the thing that frustrates, wow, that is louder. That frustrates me a little bit is when we say that thing that they're trying to do, it's not clear to me that I understand the thing that everyone's trying to do.
Exactly.
Or if everybody in this room is clear what they're trying to do or what they think everybody else is doing.
I agree with you 100%. I think everybody here has a slightly different use case.
Right.
And I don't think, I don't feel like I understand everybody's use cases well enough to design the thing.
Yeah.
Right.
So even your scenario over there, you were saying you're going to explode the number of clusters and logging in and trying to manage those individual. Yeah, totally agree. You can't do that. But are you trying to manage resources across all those clusters? Is that what you're trying to do? What are you trying to do across all those clusters, I guess is really the question.
At least right now, so we're building them, and we have a pipeline to upgrade all of them and all of our control planes, so the admin services, edge proxy, those kinds of things are all being deployed as we upgrade the clusters. So at least our management stuff is going out pretty easily. Like we have a way of doing that. But I'm guessing that our application teams they all are provisioning their own namespaces and putting them wherever they want. I could see some friction for them when they want to actually do stuff with those clusters, and some of that is can be managed, but we also are offering bare Kubernetes namespaces to some other teams, which is more flexible than our existing solution, and that's where I'm expecting a lot of friction. And it also, like we were talking about the cluster registry and what's in what, as an infrastructure team, knowing which things run where could allow us to do troubleshooting much faster when an application team says, everything's on fire, and we're like, what's wrong? It's like this thing, and they use their internal name and not the application ID name, but we could maybe get a listing of all the clusters and go, this one, that one's flapping, instead of having to go and look individually across 100 clusters or whatever.
So I think there's a couple of classes of problems, and we probably ought to categorize and try to taxonomize into these classes. One I would say is there's a multi-cluster set of problems, and there's a cross-cluster set of problems. Like multi-cluster is more like fleet management, right? How do I upgrade all the clusters one by one by one? How do I see what's happening? And then there's a question over there. And the cross-cluster cases are like, what do I want to do when I have to bridge between these clusters, whether that's services or deployments or scaling or whatever sort of semantically. Sorry, network. I mean, I'm a networking person at this point, so it all comes down to networking often, but not purely. Actually, there's like semantically interesting things at like deployment and policy and control levels that actually are about cross clusters, not just multi-cluster.
So you're right on. I'm a program manager for Azure Stack, so we're doing Kubernetes on Azure Stack, and that implies folks have Kubernetes clusters on Azure, and they wanted to have it also on-prem. And there are two main scenarios that we deal with all the time. One is solving the problem about fleet management. That's clear, it's well understood. People have a set of governance that they want to apply. It's a single organization.
Is fleet management just like an inventory of the clusters, or is it managing the lifecycle of those clusters, or is it like managing the applications? Like, this is the like breakdown that
Yes.
we really need, right? But like, fleet management means something entirely different to everybody in this room, right? So using words like that is not descriptive enough.
So if
until we like come up with that vocabulary.
Yes, so in priority order, given what our conversations with customers. One is I want to be able to apply the same policies that I'm doing on this cluster across the 20 other clusters in an easy fashion, so governance. The second one is managing the cluster control, the cluster lifecycle. So I am able to deploy, I'm able to upgrade, I'm able to scale. So that will be about the priority order of those. The other part that is very important that is coming up all the time, which is more, it's interesting, and people, just about everybody wants that I talk to, is I want to burst out. I want to have this capability of having replicas across clusters. And it comes up all the time, especially I'm on-prem, I'm on some data center, and I'm reaching a capacity limit. Now I want to be able to use my resources that I pay money for on the cloud.
So a couple things just to call out about the meta of what's going on here. One, this is the kind of discussion that I hoped that we would have here. Two, this is the kind of discussion that I hope that we will have in SIG-Multicluster. So I'm really happy that we're having it here. I hope that we can exit this session with some energy from the folks in this room, that we can spend discussing this in SIG-Multicluster to identify, what is the problem space, because we really have to map it out before we can know what to attack. And then of that decomposed problem space and like explicitly listed out accounting of the problem space, what are the things that there is enough interest in that people want from SIG-Multicluster that we should do in the community? So I'd be curious, maybe I should get out of this row of seats here. This will be a very interactive session where I sit next to you and talk into a microphone. So here's a question posed to the room. Who heard something in the last 5 minutes that they want to get from Kubernetes, that they want to get from the community? Because there's things floating around in the ecosystem, but do you want to get it from a vendor, or do you want to have a basis for it in the community? I see hands, so that's good. I see a lot of hands.
Like, I want a community and I want vendors to provide it to me. Or maybe I can be the vendor that provides it.
Maybe you can say that into the mic, Jake.
I'll just echo what you said, right? You said you want a community and then you want vendors to implement it.
Yes, because I think that's what everybody wants, right? I mean, I want to be one of those vendors that provides it to you, right? But like, I'm assuming most people, like, there are things that I don't want to do. Like, I don't want to, there's plenty of open source databases, but like, I don't build them. I want a vendor to give them to me. Well, like, my job is to like help our customers manage lots of clusters, but I don't want to just like invent something on my own. I mean, we did, but like, I'd like that to be something that everybody is providing and working on collaboratively and isn't being done in isolation, even if it is being done in open source.
So my feeling, I'll walk over towards Steve since I saw his hand. Let me say one thing. I agree. My feeling is what we want to do as the Kubernetes community is figure out what are the semantics and the APIs that we want people to rely on, such that the vendors can go off and implement those things however the vendory ways that they're going to do it. Just like we've done with storage, just like we've done with the lower levels of networking, right? Just like we've done with the higher levels of networking now. Like, we can't dictate to vendors how to implement those things because it won't fly, right? But we can tell them, look, this is what customers are expecting from you as a lowest common denominator, and this is what, like, how you extend beyond that in a sane way, and then let the vendors go crazy. And I think this is what's going to be really interesting and healthy from a sort of Cambrian explosion of ideas mindset.
So I liked what I heard. I thought just a nuance on that though is, do we want these things from Kubernetes, or do we want them from the Kubernetes ecosystem? Because some of these things might sit around and sit outside of Kube and orchestrate them. Definitely feel we want community solutions, but maybe not directly from Kubernetes.
So I'll put on my other hat as like an API reviewer, right? I don't know that I want this in Kubernetes proper, but I think I want it adjacent to Kubernetes. I want it really close. I want it in the family, right? So what exactly that means, we can argue about that. That's fine, right?
Well, let me I had a different point I wanted to make, but I want to echo on or build on that too, right? I mean, I heard like a year or two ago people saying, hey, Kubernetes is too monolithic. We want to be factoring it, right? So let's start doing it right. So yeah, that makes perfect sense. I wanted to take a step back to the previous conversation, like what problems you're trying to solve. I want to add a twist here. I want to do multi-tenancy and multi-cluster. Right? Each tenant has his own set of clusters he wants to assemble.
Next time I have like a long walk to drop a mic off, I'll just give everybody some hold music.
Just as we're talking, I'm starting to think, it's like a lot of the things we're mentioning are the same kinds of things that we wanted Kubernetes to solve for a bunch of nodes. Scheduling, affinity, like things that run everywhere, things that run in some places, capacity management, and that's a lot of the things now I'm thinking about. It's like, what is it that I'm worried about? Why do I care? Like capacity management is one of those. Is we have a lot of clusters, and we want to make sure that a team doesn't overload a particular cluster because we know we'll get a certain size, and then it'll tip over or it'll make things bad for them. And all of the same kinds of things for deployments and scheduling. Maybe this doesn't meet anybody else's model, but it sounds like Kubernetes, but the problem is instead of talking about a node, we're talking about a cluster. Or a fragment of one.
So go ahead, Jake.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this discussion is really great and everything, but like I feel like we just have whoever's in the room and like the 8 of us that are confiscating the microphone sort of talking about what we want, but like part of the reason why I think that we're not more involved in SIG multi-cluster is because sort of the approach thus far doesn't resonate with us, and that's fine, right?
Can
like
you
it's
say
just
more about what hasn't resonated?
Yeah, like I guess it doesn't. Maybe it's just the way that we use lots of clusters, right? Like, and this isn't us as a cloud provider. This is us of like how we run our microservices. Is like the idea that there's a bunch of APIs that we interact with to like make decisions about how applications get distributed to clusters just didn't work in our mental model for some reason, right? We were much more concerned with like distributing applications as like a CD process, and using APIs to do that is like blech. Just didn't work.
And would it be fair to say, Jake, that the dissonance is from this group? We got the idea of like, I think in the taxonomy, right? We're trying to. This group was focusing on the vision of like one consumer consuming a bunch of clusters, right? And your problem is providing a few clusters to a bunch of different consumers, right? More of the fleet man problem than the no.
Well, so one of the things that I heard that I want to drill into, because I want to just make sure that I heard what I thought. What I believe that I heard was a feeling that the having multi-cluster versions of the Kube APIs was not the right conceptual layer to be at, and that you'd rather be distributing applications or collections of things that meant something together instead of distributing the pieces. Is that accurate?
I think I agree completely. I was, gesticulating at, I couldn't endorse what you were saying hard enough. I think we have a whole range of individual problems that we tried to solve with one solution. And I don't think that that's what's going to work. I think what we're trying to do, I'm at Google for anybody who doesn't know. We hear from our customers all the time, I'm using 2 clusters and boy, have you made it hard, right? Like really, and honestly, every customer of any value to a vendor is going to have more than one cluster, right? So we need to tackle this problem, and if we all do it in individual different ways, we're going to just hurt our customers. We're going to completely wipe away the value that Kubernetes is trying to bring in the first place. So you mentioned specifically deployment, and I think deployment is a really interesting, exceptionally challenging problem because it's super opinionated and integrated with people's development. So when I'm thinking about multi-cluster, I'm actually staying away from deployment right now because I just don't think we know enough about what to do there or how to do it to come up with one omnibus answer. I do think I've heard consistent stories from users about things like services and policies and fleet management that seem much more approachable from a making it hurt less.
Now, one of the things that is a silver lining or an asset to us is that we have these projects that we just talked through earlier. Maybe I should also stand up again. We have these projects that we just talked through, but none of those are in a state where there is a backward compatibility guarantee from an API. They're still basically at alpha or they're on papers, so we have an opportunity to think about what we would want them to be and pick them apart, maybe do new things, and I'm glad that we're all here having this because we need more people to be present in the conversation in order to do that, and have a diverse range of wants, needs, and desires represented.
Well, and even beyond that, I mean, I still struggle with what are the problems that we're going to solve. Jake was just commenting out that it didn't resonate with us, and from an IBM Cloud point of view, the reason why it didn't resonate with us, and probably with other vendors as well, I'm sure you see this as well, is that we're managing lots of clusters, but they're not exactly the same as your clusters and how you're building your apps, because we're doing a very large number, in many cases, they're very homogeneous, right? We're not trying to distribute your applications across multiple, that's not our goal. We're just trying to manage many, many clusters for the purposes that you're going to go build really awesome applications with those. So understanding what kind of problems this SIG is trying to solve, right? And understanding and prioritizing those. Some of these problems are even a simple problem of understanding what are all the clusters and what's running on them consistently across the globe. Mm-hmm. It's a hard problem. It's hard to do consistently. And even being able to answer those simple questions, what are some of those primitives that we're going to make available in this SIG, and what are those problems that they're solving, I think would be extremely helpful.
I think understanding what the primitives are is really key. And one of the advantages that we have is that, in the last few years, there's enough prior art now in the ecosystem, if not the community, to look and mine for patterns and primitives that may deserve a community representation. In terms of translating the conversation that we are having here into action, one of my personal hopes and dreams is that as this year winds down, as 2020 winds up, or whatever it is that New Year's do, that we can have a discussion in the SIG about what are the things that are most meaningful for us to tackle in the community, and what are the order that we should do them in so that we can deliver meaningful functionality or guidance or whatever to people. Can I just get a quick gut check? I see people watching and being interested. is this conversation resonating for folks that are in this room? Can I get a show of hands if like you're feeling the tuning fork go like zzz? All right, I see hands. That's good. So how many of you will show up at the next SIG-Multicluster to talk about this? Because that's exactly what I would like to do. All right, so if everybody that raised their hand today showed up at the next SIG-Multicluster, I believe it would be the most well-attended SIG-Multicluster meeting ever to happen by 200, 300%. So I hope that a sizable portion of you do show up to our next meeting, and I would love to have this discussion to continue it, not that we're ending it right now, but I'd love to continue this thread of discussion in our community meetings.
How does one show up at this SIG-Multicluster meeting?
Well, the first step is that you turn on your computer. No, so we, there is a bi-weekly meeting. It's on Tuesdays. Lately, it has been canceled for lack of agenda. So and we can enter this continuation of this discussion into the agenda, but this actually jogs my memory on another point that I wanted to make. Just show of hands, is anybody working on something that is in the multi-cluster functional neighborhood that you'd like to share with other people or tell them about? Show of hands. All right, I see some hands. I would love for you to come and to be able to show those things in SIG-Multicluster. So to answer your original question, there's a bi-weekly meeting. It's on Tuesdays in kind of US time zone, but I think that we certainly could be flexible on accommodating schedules for folks that might be in APAC or Europe. So we can, there is a mailing list. Does everybody know about the mailing list? Okay. As an action item, you join the mailing list, I will publish coordinates for the meeting to the mailing list.
How attached is the SIG to the existing tools that are out there?
Well, that's what the survey is supposed to determine. Yeah. So the best way for us to get the highest fidelity signal about that is if you have an opinion, or if you have no opinion, please take the survey and let us know about that. Steve, I'm coming to you.
Yep, and to answer that particular question also, like earlier Paul mentioned that we have a good amount of prior art and we have done some implementations, not necessarily framing them. For example, we have some kind of service discovery that we implemented. We have some kind of distributing resources that we implemented and all. It need not be used in the same form, but we have some functionality that exists. And earlier I saw in the room that there are a lot of folks who actually are either interested in trying it or already trying it. That can be tried out. And it's not necessarily like we are not necessarily attached to that particular project itself. We are certainly open to updating it or changing it or breaking it into pieces and using it as in some other form. That should be perfectly fine in my opinion.
Hi, Steve. I would just say that I've been floating in and out of the multi-cluster SIG for about 2 years now or so. And work with Paul and Ivan and other folks. I just say the SIG's a lot of just Red Hat and Huawei, so I'm just going to speak from a Red Hat standpoint that we're very open to completely redefining this thing. I think you can see from attendance, I would sort of characterize our trajectory on this as that it's been very exploratory. And we've been incubating ideas and seeing traction, and there's not a whole lot of traction, and so we're pretty open to trying other things. And some of the patterns that we've been seeing emerging are like multi-cluster management around cluster lifecycle, and we sort of internally disambiguate that thing from managing applications across clusters. And so if folks want to go look at the cluster side, I personally think that's in the critical path of doing the applications, because before you can articulate which applications go where, you've got to have some way of representing that. So, it's just I would say that's the Red Hat point of view.
So I feel like I talk to a lot of customers and users, and KubeCon's wonderful, and everything that I've met, everybody that I've met this week and every conversation I've had has resonated in pretty much the same way. There's a marked uptick in interest in these problems, right? Like we're at the bottom of the exponential curve, but we are going to go exponential real soon. And every customer I'm talking to has these problems, and they're feeling it more acutely now than they ever have before. And so I think we have to get ahead of this curve, now. And so it's not that I think not that there's been lack of interest. I think the customers are at this next phase. They're getting more sophisticated, and the solutions need to get more sophisticated with them.
Yeah, and I think there's some value in learning what doesn't work.
Absolutely.
Like what's not resonating.
I'm excellent at that.
Hi, John, I'm from Walmart. So our use case right now is basically in the multi-cluster, we've got apps that need to be distributed out to all Walmart, same version, same functionality, needs to get there. It's stuff like checkout or inventory. And so that's like 1,500 stores or something like that, all going out with the same sort of checkout app, same versions, managing that app lifecycle. So that's our basic use case we're working with, and the concern that I'm running into pretty hard right now is like from a sort of observability and like logging sort of perspective, as all of this distributes out, potentially lands in clusters where things have changed, different versions of sort of different overlapping use cases or different, like you can target this group of clusters with this version, but then the same group of clusters with some overlap comes with a different version. And just sort of managing all the logging. I feel like I'm going to run into the limits of like a status sub-resource really quick. So I'm wondering what y'all are sort of thinking along those lines. Pretty new to the KubeFed multi-cluster SIG in general, so I'm not really sure what already exists. Welcome that information right now too.
So I wouldn't say that there's anything within the current SIG subprojects that addresses what you just articulated. I think like you've given us a data point that I would love to get from other folks. Like what are the things that are most important to you that are pressing? May I ask, have you filled out the survey? Excellent. I heard that he knows and he will.
So sometimes the right answer is a shell script that says for each cluster, right?
Exactly what I just said.
Like it's not an invalid answer, right? Like it feels sort of dirty from an engineering point of view, but sometimes it really is the best answer.
That's the provenance of the cluster industry. Brandon Phillips showed up with multi-cluster SIG and said we have customers that want to iterate stuff over clusters. It'd be nice to have an array of clusters.
Yes, so I just wanted to add a more a data point. Didn't know about the survey. Will fill it in, promise. I'm Tor from ING, Europe Bank. Very different, not issues, but regulatory issues, of course, determines a lot what we do. And we don't really want multiple clusters, but we have to for various reasons. And that changes how we view this because it's something we need, it's not something we love. We're not against it either, but it's just, it's something we need. And that really changes how we look at this.
What's the specific need that you have?
Well, there's many. And again, it's because we have to.
Is there a three most wanted that you can articulate?
As concretely as possible.
No, as in it's regulatory, it's different uses, it's different management domains, it's politics, it's no. But the thing is that what I wanted to point out is that from an organizational point of view, we don't particularly want it, we need to. But from a personal, individual point of view, it is something I find very interesting and something that I do believe this is going to change a lot in the very near future. And this is something we, as a community, really need to get on with and move on with.
So, what relationships do you want and not want between these clusters?
On some, I want them to be tightly coupled, and on some, I need them to not be coupled at all. So, therein lies the problem. But this comes down to in our aspect of the fact that this is not something we love, this is not something we cherish, this is something that we just need to do. But therefore, it's not, in our case, not going to be done with love.
I'm wondering, everyone doing like the multi-cluster, and you're getting forced into it, right?
Well,
to some degree.
Certainly, yes.
Growth,
indeed,
legal, whatever the case is, you're dealing with multiple clusters. Is some of the problem that you start off, you learned with one cluster, you grew to two, you built processes and tooling and everything across in that cluster, you know how to use it, it worked out great, and then you tried to scale it, and that's when things started to fall apart? Is that what happened? Did people just kind of back into this problem?
For us, no, not so much, but more just shifting goalposts and changing requirements.
But are you trying to use the same set of tools, the same processes, the same mechanisms that you used with a small number of clusters?
Yeah.
And trying to grow that to large numbers, Walmart 1,500. I mean,
well, we tend to have really large clusters, but then, yeah, there's something that changes. That means that you need to stay on a certain version on this, and then something else needs this, and you can't have that coexist, so therefore you have a new cluster.
If it was easier to manage lots of small clusters, would you stop having such big clusters?
I don't think I really care, to be honest.
Okay, I was just curious.
No, but it's a good thing. I don't really care, because the number of clusters doesn't really matter to me, if you can manage them right, which is what this was all about.
So like in abstract space, we could build a model of the relationships that people want between clusters, right? Whether that manifests as a Kubernetes API or as something else, to be decided, right? I think what we're missing is a way to describe. We don't have words to model this relationship, right? There are clearly needs for clusters that are highly coupled, where like service mesh is sort of the model of what people are of how they're thinking about the problem. And there's clearly sort of fleet management, but otherwise don't touch them, like don't know, like hard firewall between them, sorts of thoughts, right?
So we can do a couple more things on the mic, but it is Thursday. I know folks are tired. It's been a long week at KubeCon. And I know also that like there is a submariner talk that's starting in a few minutes that probably some folks want to go to. So let's make it last couple minutes of discussion and we'll wind this down. We can continue this discussion in the next SIG-Multicluster and here in the hallway. Sound good?
So maybe just to add a different perspective, I'm coming from the science community, and we have essentially each university wants to run its own Kubernetes cluster, but then we want to aggregate them together and not in a single supercluster, but in many independent overlays of different clusters. So how do we do that? We have done similar things in the past with other tools like batch systems, but we want to move to Kubernetes and would like to have something that works, and right now we don't know how to do it.
Any other last comments? I think I saw your hands go up.
Just adding more data point. So I'm Mark. I'm from Demonware, part of Activision Blizzard. So we run like backends for games, and I think like a lot of the conversations so far resonated. Like we run 12 plus cluster, and like managing them is a pain. I guess the word that I use to describe them would be fragmentation. So different concerns, like geo is one, like limiting the blast radius is another one, and so on. And then keeping them in sync across these dimensions has been fairly tricky, even if we have, we try to build automation and so on. So yeah, would be interested to talk more on this.
All right, great. Well, I think we're going to call it here then. Thank you everybody for coming. I hope to see you in the next SIG-Multicluster. Thanks a lot, everybody. Oh, yeah, well, put something on the agenda.
Here's what I propose. Like the next one, even if there's no agenda, the meeting's on. And we get together and we talk and we like reboot a little bit.
That sounds good to me. And there will be something on the agenda because we have identified it here. All right. Thanks a lot for coming, everybody. Thanks, Irfan. Thanks, Josh.